Alrighty, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. Very happy with the guests I have on. Been wanting to interview him for ages. We're joined by Kevin Gosztola, the managing editor of the brilliant independent news website Shadowproof. Shadowproof is a brilliant left-leaning independent news website which often takes a special interest in social justice matters, the abuse of the largely unaccountable national security state or the deep states, the plight of whistleblowers, which since the dawn of the Obama era, a lethal war on whistleblowers has been waged. My guest is famous for being one of the rare journalists who covered the trial of Chelsea Manning, and in the past several years, the trial of Julian Assange, the founder and former editor of Wikileaks. And he's also the co-host of the superb podcast Unauthorized Disclosure, which he co-hosts with the outstanding Rania Khalek, who's been on this show before. So on to the program. But first of all, Mr. Gosztola, thank you for taking the time to be here today.
It's good to be with you, and that was a fantastic introduction. Thank you.
You're welcome. And yeah, and like I said to you off the air, it's an honor to speak to you because way before I started One Plus One, I was a big still I'm a big fan of Unauthorized Disclosure because I was very much interested in the work of Rania Khalek, and of course that's how I got to know you. And then of course Around the Empire was also part of there, and yeah, you do fantastic work yourself, which is often criminally overlooked. So thank you for coming on. And
right.
so my first question I wanted to ask you. So the first question I wanted to ask you was about the imprisoned whistleblower Daniel Hale. A fan of the show on Twitter wanted me to cover this story. So my first question is, who is Daniel Hale? What did he reveal? And then of course, the stupid follow-up question is, why did the government go after him, given what he was already given what he exposed, which was about, drone warfare. A lot of people know about what's called collateral damage, but yeah, talk to us about, Daniel Hale and what people should know about his plight.
It's been a while since I've talked about Daniel, so I'm glad that you're asking me, because we shouldn't forget that he's in a prison. I'm based in Chicago. He's in a prison that's in southern Illinois. It's the Marion County Penitentiary. And it's Marion County. And this is a facility that has a communication management unit. It's one of two facilities in the United States that has communication management units. These were incorporated into these two facilities during the beginning of the war on terrorism. So it's a Bush administration relic that is still in use by the Bureau of Prisons. And he didn't know he was going to be put in this facility. I'm working my way backwards from his incarceration to what you asked me about what he revealed, to show you that this is a really harsh and draconian kind of a punishment that has been handed down to him, and a first for people who have been prosecuted under the Espionage Act. There are others who have been sentenced and have served prison sentences. There's a CIA whistleblower named John Kiriakou who did time in Loretto prison in Pennsylvania. Reality Winner is a whistleblower who's received mainstream attention and support, and she served her sentence in a women's facility in Texas. Neither of them were put in communications management units. And in a CMU, you are restricted from having contact with your family. You can't hug them. If he has a girlfriend, he's not allowed to kiss his girlfriend. He's not allowed to, if he had children, he does not, but if he had children, he would not be able to have them sit on his lap. You are kept from having contact during your visits. And
very Dickensian very Neo-Dickensian.
And when you have conversations with people, you want to call somebody, the FBI has to be available to listen to your conversations so that they can document what you're saying during that phone call. So you might be denied the ability to make a phone call. You only get a limited number of phone calls per month, and you have huge restrictions on your mail, what you can receive, and there's some other restrictions that come with being in a CMU. And so he was not told that he would be put in a CMU. He was supposed to go to a medical center because he's someone who does suffer from what most people would recognize as a form of post-traumatic stress disorder, having been in war, having been the person who was involved in finding intelligence or putting together reports and analysis that would be used to target individuals on the battlefield by drones, by using these we could just say are flying killer robots that have been unleashed in countries like Yemen, Somalia, and Pakistan, most notably, although obviously used in other fields of combat. But that's really where we got to learn how this killing machine was being pioneered by the Obama administration, because that's where they were really first used. And that's how we documented and saw the way in which oftentimes they're not just killing the people they target who were on the kill list, but they're also killing civilians that are nearby. They're also killing people who, so he said something like from his whistleblowing, it was somewhere close to like 8 or 9 out of 10 of the people who are being killed are not anyone who is engaged in militant activity that the United States would be fighting. So that's quite a lot of people who don't deserve to die who are being killed by drones. And then, of course, it's also debatable if those people who are labeled militants are truly militants and deserve to die as well, because we learned from the New York Times during the Obama administration that they were singling out military age males as militants, and many of those could be 16-year-olds who just, they didn't have to be involved in warfare, but just the fact that they presented as someone who was old enough to engage in combat if they would choose, they were vulnerable to being targeted. And a lot of this is also retrospective. So after the fact, they can look at who was killed and they can decide that posthumously, those people are not innocent, and they can find a way to say that those people deserved to be vaporized, essentially. And so he was not supposed to go to the CMU. And then he was going to go to this facility in North Carolina that was a medical center. And again, prisons are no place for healthcare. I'm not championing them as a facility that would have helped him.
Both
but
the
he was
public
supposed
and the private ones.
yes. But he was supposed to go to a facility that was a little bit more lighter and not as restrictive, and there would be some things tailored to his needs, much like the medical center that Reality Winner went to. Knew that she had some conditions that were public. So if I mentioned that she has an eating disorder, I'm not saying anything that hasn't been shared by her. She shared it on 60 Minutes, but she was allowed to have some treatment that was tailored to what she was going through. And that was something that was supposed to be available to Daniel if he was in the facility in North Carolina. But instead, he was put on a bus and transferred, or put in a van and transferred to this facility in Illinois. And he's now in these harsh restrictions, and he blew the whistle. He's someone who was prosecuted. He was indicted while Donald Trump was still president. This is one of the cases, along with Reality Winner, that is noteworthy from the Trump era. But it didn't begin with Trump. He was raided when Obama was in office. The FBI raided him. He didn't know if he was going to be charged. And then in May 2019, this is actually like not long. This is around the same time that Julian Assange was indicted and arrested and expelled from the Ecuador embassy. And so this case became one that was a hallmark of the U.S. Justice Department under Trump, using the Espionage Act to go after Daniel Hale. Espionage Act, for your viewers, being this law from 1917 that was passed during World War I by President Woodrow Wilson, that was used along with the Sedition Act to go after people on the left who were against war, who were speaking out against U.S. involvement in World War I. They said this was to go after spies, but they went and rounded up thousands of people, if not tens of thousands of people. I think even Eugene Debs was targeted with the Espionage Act simply because they were outspoken, they were socialists, they were communists, they were people who did not support the US government in their agenda globally. And so this law was manipulated. And now we find that it's manipulated against whistleblowers who expose what the US is doing in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then we've got a first of its kind case against a publisher in the case against Julian Assange of WikiLeaks. So that just shows you how they're advancing their ability to go after people who publish the truth. So Daniel's a really important person to get in mind. There's not a lot that he can say. We don't hear from him as much today because if he speaks, it's at great risk to him given the restrictions on his communications that have been imposed. And the justification that they gave at first, they wouldn't tell his lawyer why he was put in this communication management unit. And then that lawyer was told, well, his crime involved communications, so he's in a communications management unit, which is just really bizarre and also stupid at the same time. But this is what they're doing to someone who revealed civilian deaths, revealed the extent to which this killing machine is being abused by the US military. And meanwhile, while he's in prison, there's no accountability at all for the people who are involved in carrying out these strikes that result in deaths that we know should not happen. I'll just end on this note that while he was beginning his sentence, in the first months of his sentence, we had the very horrific act of these 10 people, I think it was, in Kabul who were killed in the drone strike. One of them was a aid worker who ended up being, and this man was targeted and his family was killed. Several children were killed and others in his extended family were killed. So it was like 6 or 7 women and children. And then he was one of the people who ended up being killed. And there was an investigation that was launched. They were going to see if there were any war crimes that were committed. And they come back and the Pentagon says that there wasn't anything wrong that happened. And they're not going to do anything to discipline any of the people involved, even though quite clearly this person was an aid worker and there was video evidence to identify him and show that he wasn't who the military thought he was. And so it just says that there are a lot of strikes that are happening with faulty intelligence at the very least, or there's also a lot of strikes that are being carried out recklessly and inhumanely without care for who those people actually are on the other end of this, on the other end of the crosshairs of this drone.
Well, I'll just but before I go to my next question, then thank you for enlightening me on Daniel Hale, because I wasn't too familiar with this case. Although I do remember reading a past article that the brilliant Whitney Webb did back when she was on Minpress News, and well, we won't get into what she uncovered, but it has something to do with how Daniel Hale was sort of thrown under the bus by the publication. He went to blow the whistle, the intercept, but that's a whole nother story for another day. But thank you for enlightening our audience on Daniel Hale, and I just hope that when people say free Julian Assange, we also should be saying free Daniel Hale, as well as Mumia Abu-Jamal, Leonard Peltier, and all of those. So thank you for that. So then my second question is tell us about the plight of Julian Assange. What were some of the most grotesque moments during that trial that you were an eyewitness to when you were in London? And given the High Court in the UK has rejected his appeal, is all hope done for Julian Assange? And if not, what can campaigners and his legal defense team still do?
Yeah, so I was able to follow one hearing and I was introduced as an American to this glass box that exists in some of these legal proceedings. And I assume it's reserved for terrorists. Typically, we were in a courthouse that is supposed to be for people accused of national security offenses, but they bring out Julian Assange. And this is a man who has gone through a lot of mental and physical deterioration as far as his health, because he lived for around 7 years, very nearly 7 years in the Ecuador embassy in London. He didn't have sunlight. He didn't have access to dental care, so he had some terrible issues with one of his teeth, or with some of his teeth, and he had some injuries. He had some shoulder issues, I believe, if I have it correct. So he needed care that he wasn't able to receive because you couldn't provide it in an embassy, and they couldn't bring the equipment into the embassy that was necessary to provide him care. And he's in this box being treated like a terrorist. And the defense asked the judge to allow him to sit with his attorneys and leave the glass box so that he could participate in his defense, because he was not able to. It was hard to follow the proceedings. He couldn't hear it very well. And again, he wants to participate in his defense, be able to confer with his lawyers, and if something happened, give them insights. If they have questions for him, he wants to be able to answer what they want answered. And it turned out that the judge denied this request, even though the government was neutral. That is the Crown Prosecution Service, which is the group of prosecutors in Britain that represents the US government in trying to get this extradition request approved, said, well, we don't really care. If the judge approves, he could sit with his lawyers, but it's up to you, judge. And the judge said no. She wasn't going to allow Julian Assange to be with his attorneys, which I found to be rather inhumane, because we don't do that in the United States, even with what I guess you could call the worst of the worst, the more violent accused people who go on trial. You just put them in shackles or you handcuff them, and they sit in an orange jumpsuit and they're with their attorneys, and they're not kept isolated and not allowed to be part of the proceedings. So that was a little bit shocking to me that the UK has this arrangement and how they can be punitive towards people during the course of legal proceedings. And I'm not saying that the US is great. Don't get me wrong. That's not the intention of my argument. It was just to say that of all the things that I thought were possibly better about the British system compared to the US, well, I've been introduced to a lot of things, whether it's that or the Belmarsh prison. I've been introduced to some things over the past few years that involve people who have committed suicide in Belmarsh prison. There's the fact that their protection of prisoners during the pandemic wasn't much better than what the U.S. has shown, that they've allowed the virus to spread inside of facilities without making testing available, leaving them extremely vulnerable to sickness, leaving people like Julian vulnerable to sickness. And you even had a person who was a doctor who was involved in assessing Julian Assange's psychological state for the Crown Prosecution Service get up and downplay the severity of being put under solitary confinement if Julian Assange was held in solitary confinement, suggesting that he's a strong and courageous man and he would have the grit to survive it if he was put under those conditions.
And they even used the term malinger, which was a term used towards those who were in the poorhouses during the Victorian period. Anyone who's read Charles Dickens's books, like Oliver Twist, knows that malinger was a term that was used for people who were in these awful, debtors' prisons, and basically many who did suffer from, mental breakdowns. Yeah, that was a term that was used. Oh, you're faking it, malinger.
Yeah, yeah. And that was the Crown Prosecution Service that basically said Julian Assange is reading a British medical journal and learning how he can fake his psychological symptoms so that the British court will declare him as mentally insane or incapable of being fit for trial. Or I don't know how far they were going, but they definitely were suggesting that he was making some of his symptoms up to get sympathy from the one psychiatrist who was very kind to him, and seemed to be on his side, as well as his wife's and his two sons' side, Stella and Max and Gabriel being his family. So he's suffered greatly, and at this stage, where we are at is awaiting to find out what will happen next with the extradition request. It could be sent to the British Home Office to be approved, but there may be a way that the defense can continue to prolong this and have another shot to challenge it if they would like to appeal the first decision, because they didn't have to appeal it. They won. The United States lost, and they had to overturn the decision. The U.S. had to fight to overturn the decision in an appeals court because the judge found that extradition would be oppressive for mental health reasons. Well, now the higher courts disagree, and so we're back to being where Assange is extremely vulnerable and likely to be extradited. But they can challenge the ruling by saying it was wrong for her to assess Julian Assange the way that she did, by denying him press freedom rights, by saying he wasn't a journalist or what he did was not journalistic, by saying that, some things that were concluded by the judge that leave a very bad precedent for those who may come in the future through the courts and possibly face extradition. So there's still a lot that people can do. If it does end up at the British Home Office, there's going to be 4 weeks in which his defense team can put material before that office and challenge the extradition. And it's going to be something where parliamentarians in Europe, not just in the UK, but in Germany and Italy and France, and various countries, people who are government officials in Australia, which is Julian Assange's home country, people who are in the continents of South America and Africa and the global South that have benefited greatly from learning about what the Western world is up to and how they're exploited. Keep in mind that some of the things that have benefited them collectively come from WikiLeaks in exposing the mass corruption that was unfolding in their countries, especially in Northern Africa. We saw the so-called Arab Spring in 2011. Some of that was fueled by what they were reading in diplomatic cables that were published by WikiLeaks related to Tunisia, Egypt. And they learned that Suleiman, who was the vice president and then the president for a very, very short time, was involved in torture and had the support of the FBI and the US government. So things like that. It's just one example. There are tons of examples we can go through, but just to make the point that I think you're going to hear from people in these governments. I think if we get to this moment where we're awaiting a decision from the British Home Office, we'll once again hear from global civil society organizations. It's said that unanimously human rights and press freedom organizations around the world, any one group that is worthy of its name as a press freedom organization or a human rights organization has condemned what the US is doing and understands the road that we're going down and how terrible it is if Julian Assange would actually be brought to the US for a trial.
So people power movements really need to step their game up in the in the campaign to free Julian Assange. Then, right?
Yeah, and this is the time to stand on principle and to stand up for what we do know and ignore what we don't. And what we do know is that he's being accused of publishing information that became the focal point of a lot of news stories that gave us a new understanding. I mean, these came from Chelsea Manning, so I don't want to discount her, but
Yeah.
she's not. But she's already been punished, and she's now continuing on with her life and has escaped the clutches of the government for now, so to speak. So the focus is on Julian Assange, who published these materials with WikiLeaks and has been put in this position. And we know a lot more about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. We know a lot about the corruption, the ways in which the U.S. diplomats in the State Department can do the strong arming that they do, including collecting biometric data, finding ways to blackmail their counterparts in various countries so they can get the outcomes they want when they're negotiating treaties or climate deals, for example. And that's all thanks to the work that WikiLeaks has done. The reason why the US government is very angry at Julian Assange and would like to have him punished is because of the attention that these disclosures were given by mainstream media outlets. And WikiLeaks had many partnerships with media organizations around the world. And so, no matter what people have heard on the left about Julian Assange as it relates to the 2016 election,
Which I think is something to also be commended for. Him exposing what the DNC and the Clinton campaign did to Bernie. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Those are great leaks. But to say that he was in cahoots with the Trump campaign and working to take down America through the publication of these emails, that's just a bunch of hot air and hot smoke that has nothing to do with what is at the center of this case. That might be why, and part of why, it's really difficult to get these charges dropped if you ask the Biden administration to drop these charges. But it's important to remember that this has nothing to do with the case. Very little to do with the case. They may bring it up if we had a trial. I don't want to see him go on trial, but if there's a trial, it may be mentioned in opening argument. It could be mentioned in closing argument, but none of the crimes specifically go to what happened in 2016. And so it's important for people to focus on what we know about WikiLeaks and to stand up for the right to publish, because this is about the principle of freedom of expression. This is about whether we have a First Amendment or not, because up to this point, the Espionage Act has only been used against sources. And I oppose the way it's been used against news media sources. Whether, we can run down the list, but Daniel Hale is a source. He gave him information to The Intercept. And Reality Winner is a source. She gave a document to The Intercept. John Kiriakou was a source. He spoke out and was interviewed by ABC News. Thomas Drake was a source who faced a prosecution. He came from the NSA. Edward Snowden's a source and provided a lot of documents, much like Chelsea Manning, to reporters at The Intercept, as well as The Guardian and The Washington Post, and some other outlets that did award-winning journalism on his disclosures. And I condemn Espionage Act prosecutions against those people, and we shouldn't allow it to escalate to punishing journalists who have these confidential news sources that provide them information. And what they're really doing is trying to criminalize and intimidate and discredit institutions that engage in this revolutionized model of journalism, which this is a point that's worth ending on. You may not know this, but over 70 different organizations have leak submission portals at this moment, and they're modeled after WikiLeaks. That's a model from WikiLeaks. That's the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times. Many of these different publications, they have systems set up so that they can accept classified documents if those would be it, but they don't have to be. They could be sensitive documents. They could be proprietary documents. They could be tax returns, for example, that they may want to publish from oligarchs, people who are tax dodgers like Elon Musk and others that they want to expose. But those are private documents that you're not supposed to have unless somebody leaks them to you. And so they are able to obtain those from sources who feel they're newsworthy and worth seeing the light of day because of what WikiLeaks did in revolutionizing journalism. And what the US government is doing with this case is very openly saying that they want people to be afraid to accept leaks and publish leaks. WikiLeaks' model was to show that they had these documents and put them up there as an archive for everyone to use. And that means that academics and historians and journalists who had nothing to do with the work, who weren't partners, like myself. I mean, I owe my work the way that I got started. I owe my first months of success as an independent journalist to WikiLeaks because they posted the entire archive of embassy cables, and I was able to refer to them and write stories about them. I mean, there were scoops after scoops in those cables about things that the US government was doing in many, many countries. And they're trying to make people fearful of publishing documents and making those available to the public so that not only do they learn the truth, but they're also able to make up their own mind about the stories that are written. So like, for example, if the New York Times publishes a bombshell report about activities of the US in, say, Venezuela or Colombia or Nicaragua or some part of Africa, for example, then not only do you see that story, but you also get to see the documents that led to that story. So you can figure out, is the New York Times telling us the whole truth and nothing but the truth? Or are there also details that they're hiding that you may want to get out to people and say, well, this is just, this is okay. This is a good report. We've learned something new. But there's also, like, the New York Times forgot to mention that this document also shows that, like, this happened or that happened. And so, like, right now, all the documents, most of the time, these mainstream organizations get documents and they don't publish the documents that they receive. They don't share them with the public. You're just supposed to trust that they reported on all the important information. But WikiLeaks said, we're going to partner with media organizations, and this was revolutionary. We're going to partner with media organizations, but we're also going to publish all of the files. And so after these news organizations are done, yes, they wrote about them, but no matter what, you're going to get the full truth of these documents because we're going to have the entire archive here at our website.
Free Julian Assange. Couldn't have said it better myself. Now, I just last two questions I wanted to ask you, which is, do you think in the age where you have people power movements calling for defunding or defunding / abolishing the police, that the military and the deep state from the CIA, NSA also needs to be abolished? And do any of the racial justice, social justice groups even take that into consideration when they talk about, abolishing or reforming the police? And if they don't include, the CIA and the military, why do you think that is?
That's a very detailed and complex question that you could probably fill an entire hour of conversation.
But including also, like repealing, fighting to repeal the Espionage Act and, and all that.
Yeah, no, but first off and foremost, we know that the US military and its 800 plus bases around the world is sucking this country dry. We know we're overextended as an empire. And right now, we're now funneling billions of dollars into the war in Ukraine, which, whether you think it's good to support the Ukrainians or not, it's important to point out that the people in Congress are going to make calculated policy decisions that say those people deserve the funding and assistance, while people here in the US are going to be given less support. So those people who want another round of pandemic relief, or they want some kind of economic assistance because they're still dealing with the aftershocks of the pandemic, which is technically not over, but yes, it has waned in its severity and intensity. Those people are not going to get help. And so we just have to recognize that the priorities of the US warfare state, for lack of a better term, do push aside the needs of people here in the US who could benefit from forgiveness of student loan debt, could benefit from perhaps help in supporting labor rights, etc., supporting
single payer healthcare.
Yes, single payer healthcare. I mean, definitely when you're funding military activities to the extent that we do, you're going to hear people who are supposedly fiscally conservative say, well, we don't have the money. We have to fund the military and all of this. And so with the Pentagon getting more than half of the national budget in any given year, you see that basic human needs do not make it into the equation often. And so I believe that when you look at the calls for the abolition of police, or you look at the calls for the abolition of prisons, those come from a point of view that those institutions are making life more difficult, that they're exacerbating crimes, that they do destabilize communities, that it is difficult for those families to live, that this is not actually reducing violence in communities, but in fact is leading to more problems with those family units, for lack of a better term. And so the focus on alternatives to incarceration, as I understand them, and I encourage people to listen to my colleague Brian Sonnenstein's wonderful podcast, Beyond Prisons, that he does, where he brings in abolitionists and organizers that are consistently working on this. We also have more reporting that'll be coming at shadowproof.com that explores these alternatives to incarceration and abolitionism through something called the Marvel Cook Fellowship, which we were able to raise about $10,000, which was unmatched, so that we could pay writers, a diverse group of writers, to cover the ways that organizers are actually effectively mobilizing people to challenge the carceral state in the United States. And so just that's something people could look out for, because we have a limit of time here to talk about this issue. But those alternatives are being pursued because if you could do something to replace them as the go-to, people have conflicts that they want to resolve, or there's something horrific that happens, people commit heinous acts, they decide that has to be solved by putting people behind bars, or having the police come and deal with the situation. And then oftentimes it doesn't actually serve the people. And it's debatable whether the police are actually there to help and make the lives better. And it's debatable whether the police are providing safety. And that's the same thing I think people should ask. understand the
About
premise
the
of your
military.
question. Yeah, it's the
CIA,
same thing you should ask
NSA,
about the military. Is the military providing safety to the U.S.? Is the U.S. military making the world a safer place? Because you can ask the same about U.S. police forces. And we've seen through the mobilizations around Black Lives Matter, what we've learned from, the people we say their names. Every time that there's a new name that we're introduced, another life that gets snuffed out because of a police officer. And as I'm talking to you right now, I'm familiar with the fact that Amir Locke in Minnesota, who was killed as a result of a no-knock raid, there will be no justice for Amir Locke. And so that is another name that people will say on the streets when they are demonstrating. But when we know these names, that introduces us to the way in which police truly operate, not the way that our politicians claim when they're asking for more funds for police, but the way that they actually are understood. And if that's not safety, then I think the same thing can be asked about the military based on where they're being deployed. Does that make those places in the world more safe? They didn't make Afghanistan more safe after 20 years. It's a much worse place. And you add to that the sanctions that have been imposed by Joe Biden's administration, where you have women now who are selling their organs so that they're selling their kidneys so that they can just have a little bit of money for food for the next few months. It's not even really going to get them that far, but that's what's going on. That's how horrific it is. And all because we lost, and the people who won is the group that we were fighting for 20 years. The Taliban managed to outlast the US, and they won't allow them to run the country. So they've frozen assets, and it's hurting the entire civilian population, which we claim to be there to save for 20 years from terrorists. And you look at Iraq, and it still has hallmarks of a failed state. We've been involved in Syria, and there's still conflict and war happening in Syria. You look at Somalia, and it's not like that country's any better because of US intervention. Libya has been torn into pieces, ruled by militia groups that are fighting each other. And so
South Sudan, Congo, list goes on and on and on.
Just ask yourself if this is, and I think that's your answer when you ask the question about what should be done. Should you abolish? And we didn't get to the CIA yet, but my answer is the same for the CIA. Look at what look at what we learn about them doing. And it rarely anything positive.
The Epstein scandal alone, and like the Finders Code scandal, like that alone should make people go, whoa, okay, abolish the CIA. There is no room for reform in that wretched organized crime organization, or the military, which is just the police on steroids. When people talk about, oh, we need to demilitarize police, well, yeah, but think of what they're doing overseas, the military. So why don't we demilitarize all of that and abolish the military?
Yeah, and it's not to say that there aren't going to be violent actors that have to be dealt with. It's not to say that we're not going to have moments where people need to arm themselves and fight and protect themselves from violence. But the idea of the U.S. being the world's policeman has not made the world a safer place, just as the idea of giving police all this power in the U.S. has not made the U.S. a better place.
And then very quickly, where do you stand on the whole abolish or reform the police? Are you more abolitionist or more radical reformist, like ending the drug wars, demilitarizing the police, community control over the police? Like, where do you stand on the whole, on that debate?
Well, specifically, I think it's very disingenuous to get worked up over people who say defund the police, and they focus on it. And they say the slogan is the reason why the left is facing setbacks in elections and all this garbage that I just don't think is true. I think people who are informed about what this is, who have had the chance to interact with organizers, who have experienced police brutality firsthand, and who have seen protests happen in their community know. And we got very close in Minneapolis after George Floyd. That provision to change the police department from a police department to a public safety agency only lost by like 8 or 9%. It came pretty close. And so that shows you that that community, even with all the propaganda of saying that like without police, crime's going to be rampant and you're going to see people, you know, trespassing, and you're going to see people stealing, and there's going to be vandalism, and there's going to be decay in our city, shows that they actually knew that no, the whole idea was to come up with a way that deals with this better. And so I think it's important to just be clear that I don't support policing in its form in the US, and especially given the baggage that it has, because if my understanding of history is correct, the police really grew out of slave patrols in the United States. And it was about sending them to bring slaves back to plantation owners. And so obviously police have existed in various forms, but especially in the South, they were there to return slaves to those plantations. And so when you look at what we're dealing with and how it so disproportionately targets one particular group of people, I just don't see how the police can continue as an institution. So it's clear that something new has to be developed in order to bring peace to places that have problems. You know, police aren't even a solution to gang violence that happens in urban areas, and that certainly is a problem. There are many innocent people who get caught in the crossfire between factions that are at war with each other in some of these locations, but police don't resolve it. Police don't engage in conflict resolution and find ways for peace to break out among those groups. They make it worse. They pit groups against each other. They drop members of gangs in an opposition in their opponent's territory, so that they're then beat up and hurt, and vice versa. And so we just need to recognize that there's a different way of doing this. And I think I just want to make clear that when we talk about abolishing police, or when we talk about abolishing prisons, we're not just leaving a vacuum. There is something that has to be built in its place. We don't just say that we're going to have this utopian republic in which people aren't going to be told that there are no rules or regulations that they have to follow. But what we recognize is that we've built up a punishment bureaucracy that serves the richest 1 to 10% of the country, and then is disproportionately used against the other 90% of the population. Those are the people who get policed. Those are the people who get put behind bars. If you have wealth, you can find ways to minimize the amount of hardship you go through when accountability is brought to bear against you, unless the media attention turns against you, like Harvey Weinstein, and there are various other examples of where it becomes so clear what you've done. There's nothing that you can do to turn the public you can't get away with using your resources to bail you out. But most of the time, especially if you're an unknown, you're able to convince prosecutors to go easier on you because of your wealth. And also you're able to use your wealth to get the prosecutors of various districts in the country to go after people who are marginalized, and to use that power in order to control them, to protect yourself from any threats that come from within those communities. And they're not always like actual threats of violence. Like you can use the law in order to punish people who are organizing resistance to what your business or corporation is doing. And you can use those police to repress those communities that are standing up against what you represent. So obviously we have lots of documentation of police squads engaged in domestic spying and intelligence gathering, and then the FBI being involved in this kind of activity as well, providing support to the police. So first and foremost, my position is that, it's not outside the realm of possibility to move away from the forms of policing and incarceration that we have in the country right now. And in order to do that, however, we have to seriously engage in a conversation about what we replace it with at the same time. Because if we don't chew gum and walk, then we get caught. Then we get caught because people say, oh, you just don't want me to be safe. You would like me to not have somebody I can call in order to respond if I'm in need. People who have had violent experiences, who have been helped from the police, who want to invoke those and say that, they actually want those institutions to be around. Well, you say, well, I understand. And I think there should still be somebody you should call, but we want to build a safety agency. And then we want to build a new way of dealing with people and holding them accountable for their actions. And you have to entirely reform the punishment bureaucracy that exists in this country, and recognize that sentencing for people in this country is extreme. Alec Karakatsanis is an expert and incredible voice on this matter, but there's also the Sentencing Project, I think is what it's called. And these are places where people can go to just see how extreme the sentencing is for people here in the US compared to most of the world. I mean, even when you're talking about murder, many places in the world, you do 20 to 25 years in prison for murder. And you have the potential to still get out after serving that time. And it's recognized that you're not likely to commit murder again, because you're just not going to fall back into that life having been out of society for 20 years. So you have countries that recognize that you don't need the death penalty, and you don't also have to keep people in prison without parole until they die. It's cheaper. It means that governments don't have to spend as much money. And also, it doesn't make anybody less safe, because you're acknowledging the reality of how people who are caught in a cycle of violence get removed. And then after, let's say, a few years, that's a good enough timeout for them to then be returned to society. So you don't have to keep them in prison for 25 and 50 and 75 years in order to get the outcome that you want to restore a community.
Also need to repeal the Clinton crime bill and all the stuff that Michelle Alexander talks about in her wonderful book, The New Jim Crow. Just before I let you go, very briefly, I wanted to ask you this question. What do you think it'll take for the broad American left, the white American left, the black left, the Latino and queer left? What do you think it's going to take for the left to focus on the plight of Native Americans, Indigenous Americans, and stop criminally overlooking their plights? Because I've noticed that in Canada and in Australia, there's a lot of focus on the plight of Aboriginal people, First Nations people, and I'm just wondering, when do you think it's going to take? What do you think it's going to take for the American independent left journalism and other people power groups to focus more on we need to end settler, colonialism at home and give, justice to indigenous folk.
Yeah, it seemed like we were having a breakthrough with the Dakota Access Pipeline protests that took place, and that was a project that we had multiple indigenous groups that were fighting and defending their sacred land, and they enjoyed some success, but then they also had some major setbacks. And they were also up against the Trump administration coming in after the Obama administration. After the Obama administration dragged their feet and really didn't do a lot to help them. But it did seem like you were going to see a recognition of the way that there is exploitation of resources on indigenous land throughout the U.S., how the reservations in which many of these indigenous people live, and they run their own communities independently, but how they're actually not able to live, and the way they get squeezed, and how they're not able to police and run their own communities. I know that during the pandemic, there were certain ways that some of these groups wanted to handle it, and they were even faced with the potential of police interference because those police forces wanted to enforce a certain code that they would be expected to follow, and so they weren't letting these tribes. Some of these tribes weren't being allowed, particularly in the northern United States, weren't being allowed to set their own plan for protecting their people from the pandemic. And so it's important. What you raise is something that I myself should consider, and everybody who does work in progressive or lefty leaning media or just left media should think about, because these voices, they should be more centered in what we do. And I think they speak with a lot of clarity. There isn't much that you can argue with when you ask them about any issues because of their lineage and what their ancestors have gone through. So if you want to ask them about healthcare, I mean, they can tell you all about why private healthcare is wrong, and they can tell you how they've been subject to injustice. And when you want to fight climate change, these are the people that I think should be front and center.
Exactly.
We should listen to them. And I think that, their ideas are my own ideas because if I remember correctly, they're the ones that have the 7 generations viewpoint of how when they carry out their lives, they think of what they can do, not just for their children, but they're looking at 7 generations ahead. So they're making decisions about their environment and where they live based upon what it's going to look like that far in advance. And we don't do that. White people, by and large, white Americans, by and large, and I suppose I have to indict people of other colors and backgrounds as well, are not thinking about that future. Some of them don't have the luxury of doing that because of poverty, and white and Black in parts of rural America and in urban centers of the United States. They can barely think of what they're going to be doing the next month as they're living paycheck to paycheck. But Native Americans or Indigenous Americans learn that they're supposed to look 7 generations ahead and think of what life would be like then and how they would like the earth to be. And I feel like that is a crucial lesson. And, many of the things that are wrong with our politics right now and why we're not dealing with the climate catastrophe the way that we must, and you don't really have a choice. It's kind of like, if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that science doesn't really care whether you believe that this virus is real or
Exactly.
not, or whether it's going to kill you or not, or you think you're going to have immunity and survive. You think it's a hoax. I mean, you can have that belief, but you don't know when you're going to wake up in an emergency room and be taking your last breath. And so that's very insulated and very arrogant of you to believe that, and privileged, I suppose, could be a word that we might throw around, to believe that the virus is not going to come and infect you. And I think you can use that parallel with climate change. It's very easy for people here in the US to act like they're going to be able to survive whatever comes in the next 10, 20 years. But you don't know when the wildfire is going to start near your town. You don't know when there's going to be a hurricane that makes landfall, or a tornado that is entirely unpredictable and gets reported in the weather reports as like the most dangerous and catastrophic tornado in the last 200 years or something like that. We have so many of these examples of where they're record breaking in their damage, and the wind rate and all kinds of things that are scientific about these weather events. And you just don't know when you're going to be the one who is in the pathway of these things. It's going to affect food. It's going to affect all of this. And I think, this is a great way to end this, is we should look to those indigenous people to tell us what we should do to bring this world into harmony with the earth, so that we're doing less damage to it, because the earth doesn't really care what we do. The earth does not care if we want to kill ourselves off as a species. And that's something that I think indigenous people understand. And once we figure that out, then maybe those voices will be more central to what we do, because what we're talking about here is like the first and foremost issue. I mean, we spent an hour, and we did take an hour to talk about Assange and Daniel Hale on these political prisoners. We can talk about abolishing police and prisons, but fundamentally, none of that will matter if we do not have a habitable planet. And so, I mean, I do believe in my work, even though it doesn't come up a lot, that there needs to be a focus on the climate and on the earth. And I do coverage of environmental whistleblowing and discussions of climate. There's a group, they're not even a radical group, but there's a group that will follow what the US is doing when it comes to the environment, and how some of the public employees of the government are under a lot of stress and intimidation and harassment when it comes to, like, for example, the review of chemicals that the industry put in manufactured products. The EPA reviews these chemicals, but it's an entirely compromised process right now. And there's a lot of pollution happening, and it's going to make children sick. This is deregulation at its worst, and there's hazardous chemicals that are being put in products every week that the EPA has decided to not regulate because there are chemical companies or manufacturers that have been able to strong arm them into looking the other way and allowing them to put certain things in those products. So it's just another reason why, we need to listen to them. And I don't think I have to convince people not to listen to Joe Manchin and some of the worst in the Senate, who think that they should save the coal industry from death. Clearly that's a dead end, and a lot of people, I think, recognize it. I think even Republican voters in those states recognize it, because they know that those projects are not profitable and that it's hard to find stable employment from those companies because they don't have money. They're not,
as well as the long-term
well.
damage that working in those mines does to one.
They've seen that, yes, yeah. Those Appalachian communities have seen it firsthand. They've seen their mountains blown up. They've seen their water turn into different colors that are not supposed to be what water looks like or not. So anyways, that's a long way of answering your question, but we do need to put Indigenous people at the front and listen to them. I think that might make the difference in the end between whether we survive or not. I feel pretty confident about that. I think that, where if we get to that moment where it looks like we can't turn back, we're going to have many voices that we'll be able to turn to and say, okay, they were right. The messages were there. We knew what we needed to do. We just didn't do it.
And yeah, and I think the great John Pilger, once said that, about his country, which is a settler colonial country, just like Canada, New Zealand, and in the U.S. He said that nothing will change until we right the wrongs of the bloody past. So until we give back their nationhood, we can never claim our own, and we can never call ourselves a multicultural society until radical justice is given to the Indigenous folk. Now, do you have an appointment to get to, Mr. Gosztola, by any chance?
No.
Okay, then I'm gonna be late for my appointment because we usually end the program by doing this questionnaire done by James Lipton.
Oh, great!
Inside the Actors Studio. So just before I let you go, so Kevin, what is your favorite word?
Gosh. I think you want me to just come up with the first thing that comes to my mind.
Yeah, anything.
Let's say pickle.
Pickle, okay. What's your least favorite words?
Gaslight.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Ooh. I suppose watching a good film, because it reflects back our reality, and I use it to inspire me.
Nice. What turns you off?
Twitter.
What's your favorite curse words?
Favorite curse word?
Yeah.
I suppose I'm classic, and I just like the punch of fuck.
Yeah. What sound or noise do you love?
What?
What sound or noise do you love?
Oh. I like the sound that your mouth makes when you pop with your thumb.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. And what sound or noise do you hate then?
The sound of an ambulance siren outside your just like
you live in Chicago, you probably get that a lot, right?
Yeah, you live by the hospital, and it's just very it's very disruptive to actually allow me to amend my answer. The worst thing is a car alarm sound. That's the worst. That's the worst. And especially when they don't know that their car alarm is going off and they need to come back and do something about it.
And what profession, if you weren't doing the brilliant journalism that you do, what profession other than yours would you like to attempt?
I went to college and learned to be a filmmaker, and I never went on to be a filmmaker. So I would say that I would be involved in filmmaking in some way.
And what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
I wouldn't want to be a corporate consultant.
Same with me. And the final one before I let you enjoy the rest of your afternoon is, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
I would like to hear God say that he thinks it's funny how much people on Earth talk about him.
Coming from a true deist and a Unitarian. All right. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with the brilliant Kevin Gosztola, people do check out Shadowproof. Do become a Patreon. If do become a Patreon and follow Unauthorized Disclosure, which he does with the brilliant Rania Khalek, who was on this program. It will be money well spent. Mr. Gosztola, thank you so much for taking the time. I hope to have you back on in the future, and of course, please give my very best to Miss Khalek, and I hope all is well with her, and I look forward to having you back on in the future.
Yeah, it was good to talk with you. Thanks for having me.
It's been an honor. Thank you.